When the U.S. military shot down a Chinese surveillance balloon over the Atlantic Ocean over the weekend, it capped off about a week of international intrigue about the aircraft, which appears to have first flown into U.S. airspace on Tuesday near Idaho. But tensions and questions still remain over just what the balloon was intended to do. U.S. intelligence officials believe it was sent to spy on behalf of the Chinese government. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a planned trip to Beijing because of it. For their part, China has argued it was an unmanned civilian airship and condemned the U.S. for shooting it down. So what was China's goal here, and what does it mean for the future of China's relationship with the U.S.? To discuss, I'm joined by Mark Wu, a Harvard Law professor and director of the university's Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies, and Washington Post national political correspondent Olivier Knox. Welcome to both of you. Olivier, I want to start with you first, because I've been trying to say to people over the weekend, well, it's a big deal, but it's not really a big deal, and we spy on them, and they spy on us, and this is just really more of the same, except now we're talking about it. Where are we right now as a nation when it comes to this balloon or this machine that's being held by a balloon situation?
Right now, what we're doing is we're waiting for Navy and Coast Guard crews that are patrolling the waters off South Carolina to try to collect the debris from this balloon, which the military says was 200 feet tall and was carrying hardware underneath it about the size of a commercial airliner. We're going to learn a lot more about what that balloon was doing by looking at the equipment that it was carrying in its meandering trip over 11 states before finally getting shot down by an F-22. It has obviously poisoned the well a little bit further in terms of the diplomatic relationship between the United States and China, because, as you mentioned, Secretary of State Antony Blinken had to cancel his planned visit to China. That was, I think, mostly driven by U.S. domestic politics, the chorus of bipartisan alarm over this thing flying over the United States for so long.
Mark Wu, when I was in China some 20 years ago or so, I was in Guangzhou, I was in Nanchang, and I came away from the trip and came back to the United States thinking that I had really bought into what a lot of American policymakers were telling me, that China's a huge nation filled with consumers who want to buy things that are American, and you know, they're going to really embrace Western culture as soon as they get a taste of it. And now here we are, some 20 years later, and it couldn't be any opposite than what I thought it was going to be. Luckily, I was not an expert, and I was not going on shows talking about it. What happened over the past, in like 2 minutes, what happened over the past 25 years of what we thought China was going to be like and what it is now from the government standpoint?
I think one of the major questions is, you know, what went wrong with China, and academics and policymakers are going to be debating this over and over again. But I think that presumes that history has this arc that bends towards Western liberalism. And if anything, it suggests that that may not be the case, right? China is this 1,000-year-old civilization with a rich history of its own. And certainly that applies for the rest of Asia as well. And so I think part of it is just the sense that China has embraced certain elements of Western modernism, including the market economy, technology, and so forth. But at its core, the Communist Party of China is determined to maintain its hold on power, and with that, a political system that is autocratic. You take that combined with the fact that Xi Jinping has disassembled many of the institutional constraints of the last 2 decades that were put in place to constrain that, and that's why we're where we are today.
Olivier, in your piece that's in the Post today, the 4 things that pop from the Chinese balloon incident, one of the things you point out is that the question, what's Mandarin for Veep, obviously referencing the satirical show Veep with the great Louis Dreyfus. There's been some talk that this is a mistake on the Chinese government part, this balloon being launched. Again, we've heard reports from the Pentagon that there were balloons launched during the Trump administration, balloons launched during the Biden administration, but that the idea that it would be launched and possibly discovered, most likely discovered, even if we didn't do anything about it, so close to our Secretary of State visiting China, was either an inside job in China to self-sabotage for reasons beyond our understanding, or was just a mistake of the left hand not knowing what the right hand was doing. It's not so big a conspiracy theory to jump to think that, though, is it?
No, I don't think it's too big a conspiracy theory. I mean, the timing of this was terrible, and this has been an embarrassment for Chinese leader Xi Jinping, who's been making conciliatory sounds ever since he and Biden met in Bali, Indonesia in November. Obviously, the cancellation of the Blinken trip is not something that either side really wanted. But again, this is a bit of a black eye for the Chinese on this. At least the fact that they were caught certainly is. I don't know enough about the motivations for sending this thing aloft. Apparently, there's another one over Latin America. We're going back to the late 18th century of balloon surveillance, apparently. But no, this has been, and the reason I said it's more Veep than House of Cards is that they certainly weren't expecting, I don't think they were expecting to get caught. Now, it may turn out that we learned that this was a deliberate provocation, but that just seems unlikely to me, given the state of the relationship, where the two sides have been very careful since November to ensure the lines of communications are open so that whatever aggressive competition we're in doesn't accidentally spill into a military conflict.
Professor Wu, I've seen people reference the Bay of Pigs and, President Kennedy giving an order not to have anybody fly over there. And of course, something happened. And as he said, bad things happen. People make mistakes. Certainly, this isn't to that level of a mistake or an intended provocation, as Olivier has pointed out. But I am wondering, why is it important to us? Why is it important to average Americans that there's an open dialogue, that there's a connection between United States and China when it comes to international conversations? And has it deteriorated? I know the answer is yes, but how badly has it deteriorated during the Trump years? And is Biden in a rebuilding position right now?
It's important for two different reasons. One is, of course, there are certain global issues, the pandemic being one, but we can think about climate change, global warming, any of the other terrorism issues, right, where the two largest economies and arguably the two most powerful countries need to cooperate. Beyond that, though, these two countries are locked into a strategic rivalry that is not likely to disappear anytime. And so for what Olivier mentioned, you need to make sure that there are guardrails to ensure that we don't actually trigger some type of accidental confrontation that then escalates. So I think it's important for both of those two reasons. And for average Americans, we should care because none of us want to find ourselves in an accidental war, nor do we want to find ourselves unable to solve these global problems.
One of the things I've learned over the years is not to comment on social media on international things because I really don't know what I'm talking about. I was surprised to see a number of lawmakers just getting way out over their skis, wondering why the Biden administration didn't shoot the balloon down, saying it never would have happened under Trump. Then we learned, of course, it did happen under Trump. And someone who is out there a little bit is New Hampshire Governor Sununu. He was on ABC News this week. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
This is all about China poking at us. This is all about China testing the American resolve, whether it's with TikTok or the balloon or whatever the thing is going to be next month. They know that tensions are escalating, and they want to see what kind of leadership we have. And no, the president failed on this one.
Of course, Olivier, we're hearing reports that, that may be a balloon of its own kind to test the waters, test the skies, to kind of stay with the metaphor, for a political run for president.
Well, test the waters works currently.
That's true. Good point. The balloon is both in the sky and in the water. So was this just fodder for politicians on both sides to get out and forward whatever agenda item they wanted to get out there?
Well, a couple things. The first is that both parties are locked in this contest to show who's tougher on China. That's the current national mood. The other thing, and I can't overstate this, China's been the prime suspect in a lot of very spectacular surveillance spying operations. They are the prime suspect behind the hack of the Office of Personnel Management, which sounds tedious and bureaucratic, but they actually, whoever did that, carried off the personal information of tens of millions of Americans. But that's not, there are two things that is not. It is not dramatic in the sense of being able to point to the sky and see a balloon overhead. And it is not as easily understood as the Chinese are spying from the air. So those are two reasons for which this really captivated the attention of a lot of people. Again, it's really simple to understand, and it's very dramatic.
Professor Wu, one of the challenges, of course, when we talk about China is we're talking about the Chinese government. We're not necessarily talking about the Chinese people and the actions that the Chinese government takes and the leaders take. One of the things that I think some of the kids on social media got right was you're concerned about a balloon, but here you are on TikTok, just letting anybody who is in charge of TikTok have all your personal information. I'm exaggerating to make a point. We also had periods where our face recognition technology, which we know is being used in China for things that are not necessarily just to keep people out of the Madison Square Garden. How concerned should we be in general about the products that we use that are from China that may indeed be working to our disadvantage when it comes to our privacy, understanding that Facebook isn't very much better when it comes on that front, or Meta as it is?
Well, you captured the essence. We should be concerned whenever we provide our private information to any entity with what they can do with it. That being said, what's unique about the Chinese entity is that there are laws in China which state basically the government has a right to ask the technology company to turn over any information that deems necessary for national security. And those Chinese companies will do so. And so there's a double concern there that doesn't apply in other contests in other. And so I think there's a reason to be concerned, but there's a reason to be doubly concerned when it comes to China.
I want to switch a little bit, Olivier, and talk about an issue that I've brought up a bit about the Biden administration and just how sneaky I think they are on some levels. It has pained me on a number of occasions to point out that Trump was very accessible to the press on a regular basis. I'm sure his staff was pained by how accessible Trump was, getting on and off the helicopter, getting on and off the plane. Biden has not been that accessible. We're considering, although he followed the letter of the law when it came to disclosing to the Department of Justice when they discovered the classified documents in his possession, but he didn't notify the American public, wasn't compelled to, but he didn't. Obviously, the midterms were happening right there. You point out in the Post that Biden does indeed, you think, have a transparency problem. How does that relate to the balloon?
Right. So I would say first on the documents, Biden did not wage a year-long fight against the National Archives and defy a subpoena. These are not comparable incidences with the documents. But on the Biden front, no, they do have a transparency problem. There's no reason to think that they would have disclosed the document situation unless CBS News had reported on it months after the officials first searched Biden's offices at a think tank in D.C. Likewise, there's not really much reason to think that they would have disclosed this balloon incident, for lack of a better term, except for the fact that ordinary Americans and news outlets could capture footage of it. Only then did we start hearing about it. I mean, it first drifted over American airspace and territory on January 31st. The first Pentagon statement came after it floated back into American airspace after flying over Canada for a while on Tuesday, I believe. It took them a while to acknowledge that this was going on, and I think really their hand was forced by the fact that people could post on social media really rather high quality video and photos of this amazing phenomenon.
So, Professor Wu, when the Olympics were happening, I think there were hopes in China that this would be a push forward to rebuilding the image of China in the world and certainly polishing it. Obviously, the war in Ukraine had just begun. What does China need to do now in order to get to where they want to be in the world's view?
Well, I think that's what's so interesting about this incident, because Xi, going into his third term, had clearly wanted to present a much more responsible, willing to engage with the world type of face. At the same time, back home, he is presenting this message, right? China is going to stay strong. We're going to achieve the China dream. And that includes achieving technological independence or greater autarky there. So there's two different messages that are resonating. And really, I think the West has gotten sophisticated enough that it looks not just at what China is saying, but what it's doing back home. So without some changes to the messaging back home and its actions back home, I really have a hard time envisioning how the West picture of China as a strategic rival is going to change anytime soon.
Olivier, as we wrap up now, do you think the meeting will be back on soon? Do you think Secretary of State Blinken will be traveling to Beijing anytime in the near future, or is this going to be a negotiated conversation between the nations?
I think they're going to negotiate their way back to having this visit on the books. It is in the interest of both countries to have this kind of high-level meeting. The Biden administration has made a point since that meeting in Bali between Xi Jinping and President Biden. They've made a point of sending senior officials to China. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. A number of senior Biden aides have met with their counterparts. The defense secretary has, Yellen has, Blinken has. So they're clearly invested in this being a robust dialogue, what diplomats call a frank and candid exchange of views when they mean to indicate a shouting disagreement. So I think they're going to build back to a place where Blinken can go. What is not clear to me is what was left on the table because of this postponement. I'm not sure that anyone expected any breakthroughs. I think this was more of a maintenance conversation, but I do think they're going to want to get this back on the books as soon as possible.
Olivier Knox, Mark Wu, I thank both of you for joining us with your expertise. Thanks so much.